G'day guys, so it's 20 here and welcome back to Khaba Zoo. Today we're going to be building the grand entrance to Khaba Zoo. This is going to be a big old palace that's going to greet people as they enter in. And I struggle pretty hard, to be honest, with this build. This is the first time building in Planet Zoo, at least building an actual structure, an actual building. And it was probably a bit ambitious for my first project, but I had a particular idea in my mind that I wanted to do, and I want to, get the main structures down in the zoo before I start opening it up to the public. Otherwise, well, they're going to hate it. We're in challenge mode, so it means that there's finances and people's opinions of the zoo are going to really have a big impact with how the zoo operates. So I want all the main structures down before we start letting people in. So it sort of made sense to do the grand entrance. So I just thought, let's just tackle this thing and see how we go. It's a sort of project where I sat down like in the morning time and thought, you know what, I might just spend a bit of time trying to build the entrance to the park, and then about 6 p.m. rolled around and I'd only just finished. The time just slipped through my fingers. This game is so time consuming, just starting to discover that, but it is very time consuming but also very enjoyable. So I condense all that time into about 15 minutes of time lapse. So if you want to sit through all that, then there's about 15 minutes of me building it, but then I do go into a live play around about 15 or so minute mark. But I do only select the main bits of my build in the time lapse, so it's not the whole day of me building. All the trial and error, that's all been cut out, so you're only really seeing the pieces that I think are probably the most interesting and give you the best idea of how everything comes together. So again, don't judge me too hard with all the techniques that I'm using. I already know far easier ways of tackling this project, and if I could do it again, which I'm not, I would completely change the way I do things. So you probably noticed that I did have a building here before, and like a big white Indian styled building. This was a blueprint that I downloaded from the workshop, but I really just placed it there just to get some ideas of some building techniques and to take some inspiration from that build. I've ended up placing it to the side so I can just sort of use it as a reference, but I ended up doing something completely different, just using some of the ideas of the different tools that are used and the different pieces, so then I can achieve something similar. Something else that I had to do as well was I ended up placing down that sandstone, I think it's like a 3-story building, but it's just like a wall that I placed down. I placed that down just to get an idea of how big each floor should be, so that I don't get completely out of scale when it comes to placing things down, because obviously there's nobody around in this area, so can't really use people as scale. And the windows in this game are all varied sizes, so they're not that reliable when it comes to placing it down on top of each other. So I ended up just placing that down just a bit of as a reference, because I knew that I wanted at least the tower part to be about 3 stories high. And that's what I'm working on right now. I'm working on the tower that's going to sit alongside. It's going to be like the main feature of this palace. And this is probably like my shonkiest building out of all of the building that I do in this episode. Mainly because this is like the first time I actually started piecing together some things and seeing how the game works. Probably a bit ambitious, but I sort of think that it kind of works in a broken-esque way. And what I mean by that is that I didn't want this to be the perfect build anyway. I didn't want it to look like it was all pieced together really nicely and well maintained. I sort of imagined that this grand entrance was probably built 100 or so years ago. It was part of the original architecture when they first built Khaba Zoo, probably back in the 1900s. And I would think that this grand entrance had seen better days. So it kind of worked nicely that my building style wasn't really completely on point, and that some of my pieces were sort of falling apart and looked like they had broken edges, because that sort of fits in with the idea behind this palace. So it is a palace, but it is sort of designed to be the grand entrance to the park. So it is like slightly different to what you'd imagine an entrance to a zoo to be like. And I wanted us to be a little bit like that because, quite often in India there are like palaces, there's palaces everywhere in India, but they're generally like the main entrance to a lot of different areas, whether they be parklands or whether they be zoos or whether they just be shopping centers. There's the amount of palaces there are, even in Rajasthan, there's just ridiculous amounts of palaces. So I thought it kind of makes sense to have something like this as the grand entrance to the park. And you know, at first it doesn't really look so much like an entrance to a zoo, but we do a couple of finishing touches that I think help to create that. So I wanted it to be all white, and in terms of like using other colors, I thought that blue would be a really nice touch to it, mainly getting inspiration from the blue city in Jodhpur. I'm using that as like bits of inspiration for this build. I know that my fort is sort of based on the fort in Jodhpur, and I wanted there to be like a little bit of a nod to that blue city. So you'll see a lot of the color scheme with a lot of the things that I build in this park to be sort of based around this sort of light blue color. And I also wanted to use a lot of whites as well, because there is a lot of white colors in architecture when it comes to Indian style buildings. So I thought that it might be a nice contrast. And plus, I didn't want to just use sandstone because we have the sandstone fort, and I want there to be a real distinction between what the zoo's color scheme is and what the zoo's build style is like, and then the historical fort, which would be, you know, hundreds of years old. So, you know, I want you to think about it as there's two different build styles in this park. There's the zoo build style, and then there's the ruined fort build style, and I want there to be a real clear distinction. So you'll see later on in other episodes a plan to make sure that we have some very you know, clear outlines, what is really, really old and what's just being built by the zoo. So something that I discovered very quickly was that I was building off a grid, and you know, I'm not really following a particular type of grid. I mean, I guess the tower was not the best starting point for this build approach. I should have started with the building instead, because what happened is my blueprint, or at least like the group that I was building in, they were all like separate to one another. I wasn't really building in the same group, and it meant that I had a whole bunch of different groups, and then when I wanted to select different items, they would select in, you know, so it was just an absolute mess. So that's something that I've definitely changed in my build style. Yeah, this is something that I don't want to do again, but we'll have to see, because I'm sure I'll probably forget about that. It's a weird thing when it comes to Planet Zoo, and I guess Planet Coaster as well. There's a couple of weird techniques when it comes to building, but once you get used to it, they make a lot of sense, but I'm just not quite up to speed just yet. So in terms of build style, I was definitely going for an Indian palace. I was taking a lot of inspiration from various types of palaces around India, but I also wanted to embed a bit of British architecture into it as well. Being about 100 or so years old, which is what I'd imagine this to be, I would, you know, I sort of wanted there to be like quite a lot of British architecture influences within this style. And that works really nicely in Planet Zoo, because there's also that classic theme that you can switch between. So I'm using mostly the classic theme and the Indian theme when it comes to building styles, because I think they fit in really nicely with both Indian style architecture and British style of architecture. And besides that, at the moment, they're like the only two that I'm really going for. I think they fit the best when it comes to you know, designing things in that sort of with that sort of idea behind. And yeah, like, so I guess like the main entrance is probably more British than, I guess, Indian style of architecture, but then I guess the features of the building are probably more Indian. So that's sort of like my idea going behind it, but you know, I'm definitely no expert when it comes to architecture, really just taking ideas and inspiration from different areas. So what I've noticed is that there's like a lot of turrets, there's a lot of you know, window bays, and the architecture in terms of the different features of Indian style architecture is really quite over the top when it comes to arches and you know, decorative sort of features, and the different colors that you generally use are very bold and very contrasting, which I really love. Like, that is something that I really loved about India when I traveled there, is that the colors are just so vibrant. Pretty much everywhere they're so vibrant, and I really wanted to achieve that with this type of you know, style of building too. So you can see me work some very contrasting colors, and I think that's why the white works so nicely to contrast the different types of vibrant colors that I'll end up putting onto this building. It's found it really hard to figure out the bulk of the building, and then you know, figure out how to then put in the little bits of, you know, decorative features that I wanted to do. And I guess this sort of process is going to come a lot easier when I, you know, figure out the general idea behind the architecture style of this zoo, and then we can start getting into you know, some other buildings that would be quite similar to, you know, the palace. Obviously they won't be as grand as this one, but you know, other buildings like shops and exhibitions and, you know, other things that will be around the zoo will be with a similar sort of style and using the same types of materials. So I think that's like something I really need to do. I keep forgetting to do this, but I do need to make my own. I think I might be using tags or grouping, because Planet Zoo makes it really easy for you to basically sort between different types of themes and types of architecture, and you can also make your own ones. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm definitely going to do that, because I think that'll save me a lot of time when it comes to searching, because at the moment I'm just searching all the way through the different tabs and it just takes forever. So now I'm starting to do some of the archways, and this is something that I thought really created a lot of detail in this whole build, and something that I really enjoyed doing. Basically, the second floor is out just a little bit further over the lowest floor of the building, and it just creates this nice hanging effect. And I think I'm going to do that with most of the buildings, because that is very typical in Indian style architecture. Also adding in these like little trims, I guess they're called. These gold ones, and again, something else I'm going to do a lot. And I did that basically just by rotating one of the pieces of wood, just so that the corner was poking through, because that was like the smallest one I could actually find. I'm following a lot of tutorials from Paulsley and Geekism and the Masked Bandit. I mean, they're just some of the people that I've been following. Some really great useful tutorials as well. Oh, and Rudy Rencamel, like, amazing. It's been so helpful when it comes to building. Quite often I would you know, start recording, and I might like record like 30 seconds and then go like, okay, I have no idea how to do this, and then I'd go watch a tutorial, and then I come back and press record again. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work that I'm doing that I'm really glad that I ended up deleting, so you guys didn't have to see that. But do let me know what you think about the time lapse, if you want me to slow down the footage, or if you want me to include some of the mistakes that I'm doing. I know that YouTube tailors for videos that are much longer, but I also don't really want to just release really long videos of just music and me building, because I think that'd be quite boring, and I want to keep my videos still quite entertaining. I usually set them around the 25-minute mark to you know, I think that's sort of the sweet spot when it comes to content and the sort of work that I get done. But just know that I probably delete probably about 10 or so minutes worth of footage. If you you know, that could be footage you could be watching, and if you want to watch it, then let me know, because then I might change my mind and add some of those bits in. Something I also want to talk about with the build that I'm doing is you'll notice the entrance to the actual building, to the park, is really quite grand and over the top in terms of architecture, but then the back of the building is really bland and there's not much going on. This is like really typical within theme parks, and it's also quite similar in zoos, where the main entrance where people can see is like really quite amazing and looks fantastic, but then when you sneak around the backstage, it's generally pretty average. So I wanted it to be like that too, because even in old style architecture, it's still very similar. And I was really surprised when I went to India. A lot of the palaces did the same thing. They'd be so grand and so amazing, and you'd be like, oh my god, I can't believe they've built something this incredible. And then you'd sneak around the back and you'd be like, oh, this is just a regular old building. You know, you could almost see the cracks, and you could see all the bits of pieces that you didn't really want to be seen. But I do find it kind of interesting when that sort of stuff happens. You saw me just change the location of the palace. This is something very typical that I do in my builds. I think it's going to fit into this particular area, but then it ends up not being in that area. But I am glad that I changed the location, because I think this spot fits much better, and it just gives me a bit more room for when people actually get into the park. We can have a nice plaza and some walking areas, and get into the actual zoo exhibitions and stuff. One last thing I want to talk about before we get into the live play. The actual palace itself isn't quite as large as you might expect. The palace, or at least the entrance that I was taking inspiration from, the one that I downloaded from the workshop, and in fact a lot of the other ones that I downloaded from the workshop as inspiration, they were massive, and I didn't want it to be quite as large as that. It's actually quite a lot of forced perspective. I know that Silverite talks about this a lot, but there's quite a bit of forced perspective going on in this park, mainly because the actual fortress on the mountain isn't quite as big as you might imagine, but I did want there to be a bit of forced perspective so that some things will look really quite massive when they're not quite as big in real life. But guys, that is it. We are going to get into live play, and I'll talk a bit about everything that I got up to. I am so happy with how this turned out. It took me such a long time to do, and it's pretty shonky, to be honest. There's some bits that definitely need some improving, but for my first proper build, I am so happy with how it turned out, and I think it's just going to be such a grand entrance for Khaba Zoo when people start wandering in. It's just going to be so epic. We have a lot of brokenness now with my park, so I mean, look, this is going to be like the common thing for like the next 3 or 4 episodes until we actually start getting animals in the zoo, we start getting attendance back up. I mean, these guys are just going to have to put up with... look, I'm just going to have to keep it on pause for a while. Okay, so it's going to be a while until I actually get some animals in here, but for the time being, we're just going to be working on the main entrance and figuring out where most of the facilities and ideas are going to go, and then we'll start getting people back in. But for an entrance, I mean, how grand is that? So people are going to be walking in from here. What the idea is I'm going to have some sort of like car park that's going to stretch around here, and then I'm thinking maybe something around here, maybe like staff facilities, warehouses, staff rooms, that sort of stuff, you know, near the main entrance. But guests are going to be coming in through here. Now it's on like a bit of a hill, which is what I wanted it to be, on a hill, and you know, it's pretty gradual. It's not too lumpy in areas. I mean, it can get pretty bad, you know, pathways and stuff with this game when you go on a slope, but I'm pretty happy with that. So you come on up. I want there to be like a mix of flowers and shrubs, but I did want it to be fairly grand, and these cypress trees I think really help for that. I've done a couple of things off camera, so I don't know if I did these off camera, but I was feeling like it didn't really feel too much like a zoo entrance. It felt more of like a palace, and I thought, let's get a bit of a zoo entrance theme going on so that you can actually tell it's a zoo. So we put some animals in, and oh, he looks like he's attacking the giraffe, but you know, you get the idea. Now it looks a little bit more like a zoo, and I like them. I think they work really nicely. I didn't even realize they existed in the game. So we got the main entrance here, we'll talk about in a second, but this is where people buy the tickets. So the idea is that people walk in, they buy the tickets here, and they go through the entrance right there. And look, we're going for a general palace theme. It's what I'd imagine would be fairly old, maybe like 100 years or so old, and then there's a couple of like modern touches to it. So this glass is a modern bits of detail work, and probably these pictures here would be a modern little touch, but the general architecture is fairly old. I would imagine about 100 or so years old. I don't know what it would have been before it was a park entrance. It probably has always been a park entrance. But I don't know. Who knows? But I wanted it to be like a mix of old and new. So that's why we got some more of like a modern touch at the back of this. It's very grand up the front, but at the back it is pretty ugly, and that was intentional. I need to figure out this grass too. So we've got a couple of other entrances. This is obviously for the staff, and I plan to do another entrance for staff around here too when they get into the more staff facilities. But for guests, they're going to be entering through here, which we'll have to do some sort of detail work in there. And look, we have to fix up some bits and pieces. I could do a Khaba Zoo sign here, but I don't know if I will. Kind of like it that there's no names on this. It's just a grand entrance and that's it. But yeah, guests go through the doorway and then they exit through here into the park. But I think I might change the location of these somewhere around here so that when people actually come out, they're more greeted with the fort, which is is sort of like the main attraction for this park. Let's be honest. I mean, something that I really love about this is that, like, you know, angles like this where you can see this white palace and then in the background you just got this fort looming in the back. I think that's so awesome. So sick. Something else as well, don't know if I mentioned this in the time lapse, but I wanted there to be a bit of a mix of foliage. So around areas like this, we have like more classic type of foliage you'd find in grassland sort of biome. But then around the zoo entrance, we have more introduced species. So we have like oak trees and cypress and palms. Obviously, they're not native to this grassland, but I wanted it to be like that, to be a bit more like a garden, introduce species around the entrance. And you can actually see the difference in color, which is something else that I wanted to do. In terms of next episode, I am going to work on some staff facilities around here. I don't know how big I'm going to go, but that is the idea, to get some staffing. Because I do want us to start pushing towards opening up the park. We can't open it up like this because there's just nothing going on. People will hate it. So we'll have to get some staff facilities in here, and then we'll start progressively getting into the actual park, moving in some animals, and getting a roll on with actually making some money. Because, you know, $230 million is great, but we'll have to see how we go, because eventually we're going to definitely start losing a lot of money. And I don't want to tank it, because I've just put a lot of work into this and I don't want to totally ruin it. So that is it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of everything we've been up to, and if you have any suggestions of things that I should add and change, then yeah, hit me up in the comments, or hit me up on Twitter, or wherever you like to leave your comments or suggestions. That is it for this episode. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later.